In this Different Perspectives episode, I get to speak with Noah Smith and Mark Krikorian about immigration. Noah is an American blogger, journalist, and commentator on economics and current events. He obtained his doctorate in economics from the University of Michigan and currently writes for his own Substack called Noahpinion. Mark has been the executive director of the Center for Immigration Studies, an anti-immigration think tank in Washington, D.C., since 1995. Mark is also a regular contributor to the conservative publication National Review and is a regular participant at National Review, The Corner.
Yep.
So let's do it.
You went to Soviet Union and lived in Soviet Union?
Yeah, I was a student there for 2 years. It's Armenia. It was free. I'm Armenian. So I figured it'd be getting a job after graduate school. So I basically goofed off for 2 years. And nice. I did my master's thesis research while I was there. So I wasn't totally goofing off.
They didn't convert you? You didn't become a commie?
No, that was the thinking, but it didn't work. That didn't work for anybody.
Where were you in the Soviet Union? In Moscow?
Yeah, I was a student there for 2 years in the 80s. I was there when Andropov died, and then I was there when Chernenko died. I actually voted for Chernenko in what they kind of laughably referred to as an election. Not under my own name, but I just voted for somebody else. Yeah, anyway.
That's crazy. Well, we could start talking about history because I am a history nerd. So let's.
Noah finish chewing his food, so he's not, so he doesn't end up.
So
his introduction is chewing.
I'll record the intro separately. It's fine.
That's fine.
So we can say that undisputedly America was built on immigration, and most Americans have ancestors that have emigrated from Europe, Asia, other parts, or have been taken here as slaves from Africa. So I think the immigration debate is about more than just policy. It's about what it means to be an American and your values, traditions, and history. How has our immigration sentiment shifted, historically, and what contributed to this shift?
Well, was that a question for me?
I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, both of you.
Oh, all right. Well, yeah, it's hard to gauge immigration sentiment because, we started doing polls, I think in around 1990, we started doing tracking polls on this. And the sentiment was very reliably sort of anti-immigration during the 90s. And then what's interesting is that it sort of shifted more recently in the 2010s to become pro-immigration, but there was not necessarily any obvious change in public support for actual immigration policies. So it's very hard to gauge public sentiment. You can certainly, read books about the various waves of anti-immigrant sentiment in the United States in the early 1800s against primarily Irish and South German immigrants. The anti-Catholic panic and the anti-Chinese panic of the late 1800s, the big push for restricted immigration in the 1910s, which was ultimately successful. And then various other, sort of outbreaks of anti-immigration sentiment keep popping up again and again. It's very, very difficult to gauge what sentiment really is and when it matters, I think. Mark, what do you think?
I mean, first of all, I'd step back some. America is not a nation of immigrants. It's a nation with immigrants. We've had periods of high sustained immigration, and we've had periods of relatively low immigration. And for instance, we had, relatively speaking, before the French and Indian War, a period of significant immigration for decades, generations. From the French and Indian War to the Irish potato famine, we had a lifetime's worth of very little immigration. It's telling that Alexis de Tocqueville in Democracy in America literally never once refers to immigrants, immigration, nothing. Traveled across the whole country. It never came up. Doesn't mean there were no immigrants. It just wasn't all that important. And then we had
It was very high at that. It was high at that time, though.
Not 1830. It wasn't really. I mean, it was.
Oh, no.
1848 is when it really picked up. 1820 is when they started recording immigration stats. 1848, with the Irish potato famine and the Continental Revolutions,
That certainly
especially
produced
in
a bump,
Germany.
but in the 1820s and 1830s, there was a very large amount of immigration to the United States.
It stopped basically in, as Noah said, 1920, 21, 24. So we had a lifetime's worth of mass immigration. And then we had about 50 years of relatively low immigration. We've always had immigration, but it's gone in waves. And we are now, maybe as early as next year, going to be exceeding the highest percentage of the population that's foreign born ever in history. It was 14.8%, 14.7% roughly in like 1890 and 1910. It's going to pass that probably next year, maybe the year after. And, you know, this is not, I don't even know that anybody's done research on this, but when the population, the foreign-born population starts to get close to 15%, you know, there seems to be a reaction to that it's not that immigrants are the problem, it's that too much of a good thing is too much.
Too much of a good thing is too much. Well, you said in one of your interviews.
I like to eat, but I eat too much, you know, and I need to go on a diet. And quite frankly, you know, I won't give the whole 20-minute speech here, but mass immigration is something that we were able to successfully deal with in earlier phases of our national life. But we have politically, not politically, but socially and economically in other ways, we've matured. And I don't mean that we've outgrown something childish. What I mean is that the body politic has changed. When you're 7 years old, you can eat donuts. They're good for you. When you're 57 years old, you can't eat donuts like that. Same donuts. Your metabolism has changed.
That's not right, man. We've got a childhood obesity epidemic because the kids are getting too many donuts. So, like, I don't think this metaphor really works here, man.
My editor didn't think so either. That's why she took it out of my book.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't say donuts are healthy for kids to eat. If that's the pull quote, I think the argument's in trouble. But anyway,
the point remains that in agricultural or industrial economy, it's a very different situation than in a post-industrial knowledge-based economy. Immigration plays a different role, and it's much more problematic. Not because immigrants can't find jobs. They find jobs. There's no question about it. But they are coming into a very different situation. Today's immigrants are really no different from, you know, your grandma from Palermo or what have you. What's different is us. We've changed. The economy's changed. The government has changed. Technology has changed, and immigration is just more problematic than it was in the past. And frankly, we kind of gloss over the tumult that immigration caused in the past as well. We look at it through rose-colored glasses.
Would you say that's because of automation? A lot of the low-skilled jobs are being automated?
I don't know. I mean, that's part of it. There's no question about it. I would say more of it is the advances in transportation and communications technology shrink the world. And that makes a whole variety of things. That's good. Obviously, it's good. It makes assimilation, though, more complicated. It makes security issues more complicated. And it makes immigration less necessary because we can import the output, whether it's physical or, you know, knowledge-based output of people from overseas without actually importing the people.
Noah, what do you say to that?
Well, what I just heard was, I think, what they normally call a gish gallop.
A what?
But a gish gallop is just a whole bunch of fairly unrelated arguments, all aiming in the same direction. None of them especially well supported by evidence, but you know, all sort of having the same kind of ideological valence and all claiming to support the same point, but, you know, skipping very quickly from one argument to the next. I could go through all of those ideas and talk about them, and I think they're probably all either unsupported or just, you know, just we don't know, or clearly wrong. But there were just so many of them, such a blizzard of anti-immigration arguments, that it's very difficult to kind of address them one by one. And that's what a gish gallop is about. It's supposed to overwhelm your ability to rebut individual points. So I'm sure that's an effective rhetorical technique. But instead, let me give an alternative overview here. In terms of the actual number of immigrants coming into our country as a percent of our existing population, I'm talking about the number of people coming in as a percent of our population. We're nowhere near the levels that we enjoyed in the 1800s. The reason why immigrants are a larger percent of our total population, why the stock of immigrants is a larger percent of our total population, is for two reasons. Number one, we had a big immigration wave in the 1990s and early 2000s that then ended, that then subsided. And we have the remnant of this wave, still here. And the second reason is because Americans just don't have nearly as many kids as they used to. So, natural population growth is much less. Now, if you look at natural population growth is less and say, well, that means immigration should be less too, because, the number of the amount of natural population growth allows us to absorb immigrants more easily. So the more babies we have, the more immigrants we can also take. If you look at it as this sort of zero-sum game between native-born people and immigrants, then then maybe you say, okay, well, we should reduce the immigration amount too to bring down the foreign-born percent of our population because we're also not having kids. I don't think that makes sense. I think the fact that we're not having kids makes immigration more urgent. And if you look at the economic justification for immigration, which did not appear in Mark's long list of arguments, then you see that immigrants are the ones who work in the old folks' homes. Immigrants are young and pay taxes that goes to support pensions and Social Security and all those things. Basically, there's a million ways that young working immigrants are needed to support, old retired native-born Americans who didn't have that many kids and whose kids didn't have that many kids. And so our old people need immigrants, but the fact that we are an aging society means that we need immigrants more economically, or else grandma is going to be poor. And that's just blunt, numbers. That's just a fact. And so I think that has to be the starting point when we talk about immigration is, yes, I think many Americans have an ideological attachment to the idea of us as a nation of immigrants. And I think that that's right. And I don't think that replacing that with the phrase nation with immigrants will carry a lot of water, because when you do surveys and polls, you see that this idea of past immigration and my ancestors came to this country and made good and blah, blah, blah is very important to Americans. But so I don't think we're going to replace that ideal of nation of immigrants anytime soon. But I think that our starting point can't just be, an ideological argument like that. Our starting point has to be an economic argument of, we are an aging society. We like to increase fertility to replacement rate, but we don't really know what policies do that. We don't, we can increase fertility a little bit with generous childcare subsidies, and we absolutely should do that. I'm for that. I'm all for, pro-natalist, pro-family policy like that. Mitt Romney has probably introduced the best package of pro-family, pro-natalist policies. But I think that, the track record of these policies is fairly modest. And if you look at the blunt economic reality, we can either let grandma be poorer, or we can keep immigration going. Of course, I should stop talking before I start gish galloping. But I think that if we look at all the purported problems of immigration, the difficulties, we're going to find that these are less than the immigration opponents would have us believe.
Let me first defend myself against the gish gallop, which I love the phrase. I never heard that before. And then talk about the, we need immigrants because we're not having enough kids.
Right.
Actually, what I'm offering is actually a unified field theory of immigration restriction, because there in fact has been a tendency on a lot of people to say, okay, what are you concerned about? Whatever it is, here I have an argument for you why immigration is too high. Sort of pick one from column A, one from column B. So there is, there's no question there's a certain amount of that. It's the thing is, immigration is, this issue is kind of like the proverbial blind men feeling an elephant and they all feel something different. One bumps against the leg, thinks it's a tree. One grabs the tail, thinks it's a broom, that sort of thing. It's all the same thing. And what the same thing is, mass immigration is incompatible with the goals and characteristics of a modern society. That relates to economics, to government expenditures, to assimilation, to security, and even to demographics. And let me touch on that. Noah is saying basically that Americans are defective or broken. I mean, maybe not even an normative
I am not
sense,
saying anything of the sort. Americans are neither defective nor broken in any way. Americans are quite healthy.
They're not having enough kids. They are falling short of Noah's expectations. And not just Noah. I mean, this is a common argument. And the fact is, America is not some corporation that we're trying to, maximize shareholder value. It's a nation with people in it. And American moms and dads should be the ones mainly deciding how many Americans there are going to be in the future. And if Americans aren't having enough kids, I actually agree with Noah on not so much pro-natalism, but anti-natalism. In other words, measures that the state can take to try to remove or lower the barriers that are causing people to decide to have fewer kids. But there's a limit to how effective that's going to be, frankly. On top of which, it's not clear. It's entirely possible that large-scale immigration actually helps suppress fertility.
Is there any evidence for that? So I would like to address that, by the way, because during the last push for immigration restriction, there were, in the 1910s, there were a number of people who argued exactly this, the idea that immigration represses native-born fertility rates. It went by the name that would not be politically allowed now, which was race suicide. The idea that if you got a bunch of Italians, then British Americans and German Americans would stop having kids because it was never really explained why this would happen. If you look at, I've heard this argument, but when you look at the data, there's absolutely no support for the idea that immigration levels reduce native-born fertility. In fact, if anything, they seem to be correlated with an increase in native-born fertility in places where immigrants come to. So that just seems to be, frankly, made up. I'm not sure what to, that's made up. Sorry.
Maybe. I'm not asserting that it's true. I don't think there's been enough research on that, and I think it's entirely plausible that certain populations will see drops in fertility, but maybe not. I don't know. Well, I'll concede it.
I mean, in the Southwest, where we saw higher fertility, Mexican immigrants coming in during the 1990s and early 2000s, in those areas, we saw a slight increase in white and black fertility as well, which are typically below replacement level, both of those.
And I mean,
but who knows if that's causal?
Yeah, and that's
just because there was an economic boom.
Exactly.
In the Southwest.
That was my point. Right.
We don't know, but I'm saying there's no evidence for this. This idea that, so say a bunch of people come from India. Why does that mean that, white or black Americans whose ancestors go back many generations are going to say, well, there's all these Indian people in my neighborhood, I'm not going to have kids now. That doesn't make any sense.
No, it doesn't make sense. And that's no data. No, that's not the argument. The problem is that the argument would be that mass immigration creates conditions, economic and other conditions, that lead people to want to have fewer kids. But I concede I have no idea whether that's true or not. But the basic argument you're making is that because fertility is lower, we need immigration to replace them. Americans aren't having enough kids for your liking.
To keep not for my liking. It's not like an aesthetic thing. Like I just want to see, wow, I'd like to have more young people around. I mean, maybe, but that doesn't matter. The point is that the reasoning is simply it's brute economic reasoning. Who pays money to Social Security? Who works in the elder care facilities? Who takes care of grandma financially and physically? It is immigrants. It's just indisputable.
And that's because we have had an enormous wave of immigration. In other words, you're arguing that something that exists must exist. It can only be this way. The fact is, large-scale immigration changes the decision-making of Americans in where they're going to live, what jobs they're going to go into, and even what research businesses are going to invest in if you're talking about automation. My only point here is, because there's a lot of immigrants in old folks' homes, working in old folks' homes, it doesn't mean that therefore old folks' homes can only be staffed by immigrants. But let's move, and I'm not conceding anything here. I'm just saying let's move beyond that.
Only staffed by immigrants now.
Every country in the world, including apparently Niger now, is seeing its fertility drop. There's only a few countries in the world. What? I thought I shot
Niger.
What's that?
Even Niger, the last holdout of high fertility in the world.
Yeah, one of them. I mean, Chad, Niger, and Mali. It was just that I read something. I think it was Niger dropped somewhat. And Yemen and Afghanistan. They're like the only places that haven't seen drops in fertility. It's everywhere.
Everyone's fertility is dropping. They'll all eventually drop below fertility rate, a replacement rate. In 2150, immigration is no longer going to work to replace,
Mexico's fertility, total fertility rate is already
Mexico's below replacement.
Yeah, well, it's at replacement.
And that's why the Mexican immigration wave dried up in the 2000s and 2010s.
Well, that's part of the reason. The other reason is they made the historic shift from the land to the cities. Their people, except half of them moved to our cities. So that's, absolutely, that's why it happened.
So let me just go briefly back to one thing you said during your intro, Mark, which was you talked about these waves. Immigration comes in waves. We get a bunch of immigration and then less. And you talked about the potato famine and the big wave that did happen in the 1840s and 1850s, and also that coincided with persecutions in South Germany that sent a bunch of German Catholics here at the same time. And so after that, there's a big wave that stopped, and the Civil War had something to do with it. But honestly, we recruited a whole lot of immigrants to fight in the Union Army. So, but then immigration only picked up again, years after the Civil War. It started accelerating again. And there was even a period where people were so worried we wouldn't have enough farming immigrants to farm the land. They wanted to just pay Swedish immigrants to come over in the 1870s. And so there was a wave that crested and then it dipped. We saw a big dip in immigration without any restrictive policies. All the know nothings and all the people who wanted the restrictive policies in the 1840s and 1850s got sort of swept away by the Civil War. Everybody forgot about them, and we didn't do any immigration restrictions. And yet we still saw this big dip in immigration when that wave ended. And something very similar happened in the late 2000s and 2010s with Mexican immigration. The big Mexican wave, for the reasons that you and I just said, dipped a lot. And we saw this big dip in immigration. So we do see these natural waves. And I think people would benefit from knowing that big Mexican wave did end on its own without us. I mean, we did build, border fencing at San Diego and places like that. And maybe that did something, but really it mostly ended on its own due to conditions in Mexico. So these things do go in waves, and it doesn't always require some big sort of enforcement crackdown to make the wave end.
Yeah, I mean, the fact is, immigration from particular countries may well crest, although we're still getting significant immigration from Mexico. It's just not as high as it was in the 90s. But there's a lot of countries in the world, and when you look at the immigration stats, they actually there was no cresting. There was a couple of years in the 1870s where immigration was a little bit lower than it had been, but it was basically on a pretty much steady upward trajectory. It's just that in 1880, it actually jacked up way higher than it had been before, and because there was immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe. Immigration is not going to end on its own. Immigration from a particular country, when conditions radically change, it will, in fact, eventually end. Norway sent 10% of its whole population to the United States in the 19th century. There's not a lot of Norwegians coming here now. It still happens, but not very much. And that's because nobody wants to. Why would you leave? But
weather. Man, have you been to Norway?
What? No, I have not been to Norway.
No, you would. Well, let me tell you, half the year is the most depressing
Well,
thing you've ever encountered.
I don't doubt that, but they can all go to the south of France because they're part of
That's
Schengen.
true.
Right?
That's exactly
so. But my point is, the immigration wave that we experienced from the big wave from 1880 to the 1920s ended because of policy. It didn't end on its own. It was stopped by policy, and then it was restarted, as it were, by policy. Not the way people imagine. There's all kinds of unintended consequences when people passed the 1965 immigration law, which undid a lot of the changes in the 20s, from the 20s. They had no idea.
That wasn't the first law loosening the. There were laws in 1950s.
Right, but the 65 Act changed fundamentally the whole structure, the way we did immigration, because we had national origins quotas where there was a certain number from this country, certain number from that country. It was a Mickey Mouse way of limiting immigration, but the 1920s were what they were. The fact is, nobody expected to start a new wave of immigration, but policy is what launched the wave that we're experiencing now, and policy can stop it. So, I mean, the first question is, and I don't know what you think about this, Noah, is can the immigration wave be stopped? Because a lot of people on your side, libertarians especially, but even a lot of folks on the left, basically say there's nothing you can do about it, just lie back and think of England, as it were. And that's just not true. Immigration isn't totally under policy control. It's not something we can say, okay, well, 0 people will be allowed into the United States tomorrow. That's
not. You just compare immigration to sex?
Yeah, kind of. Yeah.
Is that an argument against it?
No, it's just a metaphor.
Okay.
But the point is that immigration is responsive to policy changes, and it can be dramatically reduced. And, even dramatically reduced. I mean, if you ask me, my ideal immigration policy would be like 60% less immigration than we have now. That's still more immigrants, still the admission of more immigrants for regular permanent settlement on a path to citizenship than any other country takes, but it's a lot less than we have now, and it's possible, and that's the first question.
But of course it's possible. But Mark, I have a question for you. If I had asked you, what's your ideal immigration policy? What percent would you like to reduce immigration by? If I had come to you and asked you that 10 years ago, all right, 2013, when they were considering the big Senate immigration reform and all this stuff, if I had asked you, would you like a 60% reduction in the, sort of inflow of people? Would 60% have been the number you gave in 2013? Would you have said a lower number, a higher number?
I would not have picked. I don't have a magic number. But first of all, the answer is basically yes. But let me explain why I'm saying 60%.
Okay,
it's not a magic number.
Okay, it's not a magic number. But I guess what I want to say, I always think of this line. Do you know the opera Hair?
No.
The musical.
Oh yeah, of course. It was
musical?
directed by a Czech director, Forman.
Yeah. Nice, yeah. And I always think of this line from one of the songs where this guy stands up with a big American flag and he says, "I was born an American and I live an American and I'll die an American in America with Armenians." And so I always just think of that line. I talk to Mark because he really wants to pull up the ladder behind him, doesn't he?
Yeah, 100%.
Someone else is like, why do I have to hang around these damn Armenians? Why are they invading my country?
Yeah.
What did I miss?
Oh, nothing. We were just. She was filling me in on her own situation.
Where was I and where were you? I don't remember where we.
I sang some lines from a musical. It was,
Okay, well I can do that. Yeah. Oh, okay. Well, Hair, I get that. Yeah.
All right. So when you're ready, let's record, and I'll just pick up where I.
Yeah, we're recording. I'll edit
recording anyway.
Oh, we're recording. Okay.
Yeah.
So, what was I saying? Immigration has dropped a lot. It dropped some after the big Mexican wave subsided in around 2007-8, And then it dropped a lot more. It dropped some, due to Trump's restrictive policies, and then it dropped a lot due to the pandemic. There's been a modest rebound, but so far the most of the indicators haven't rebounded yet. And so I'm just wondering if this idea of a 60% drop stays the same even after a 60% drop. Like,
Right.
is it just like, let's drop it more? Let's drop it more. When does it end?
First, yeah, I understand. First of all, immigration didn't really drop. I mean, it dropped under Trump. It did, because of Trump and because of COVID. It's back where it was, and basically it's sort of on the trajectory it's been on for years. I mean, we've got, I'll give you the link, and we've got the foreign-born population. It grew more slowly under Trump than under Obama, but it still grew. And there's no significant
that's not a measure of immigration
in the trajectory. There just
the foreign-born population percent is not a measure of inflows. It's a stock, not a flow.
Sure, yeah, but I mean the stock is what matters, not the flow.
What's the evidence for that?
What do you mean?
What's the evidence that the stock is what matters?
Because that's the number of immigrants who are in a country. I mean, they're two different things. They both matter in a sense, but the flow isn't even
what's the evidence
down.
that the foreign-born percent of the population matters? Where's the evidence for that? Why is that a number I should pay attention to? Why does that matter?
I don't know why it matters to people, but it matters.
Where's the evidence that it matters to people?
I don't know. Good question. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe not. Let's say it doesn't matter to people.
Let's say that number just isn't the number that matters to people. Maybe the number that matters is the flow. Or
why does
other
that matter?
Subtle things,
I mean, why does the flow matter and not the stock? They both matter.
I don't know. Why do either of these matter? Why do you think? I mean, we've seen, in the 2010s, we saw extremely favorable opinions toward immigration on all the polls, whereas in the 1990s, we saw extremely unfavorable opinions toward immigration in all the polls. And yet in the 90s, we had a very permissive immigration policy, and people didn't kick Bill Clinton out of office for it, and they didn't kick George W. Bush out of office for it. Even though, according to the polls, they were mad. They didn't want the immigrants. But then in the 2010s, suddenly we got a much more permissive attitude toward immigration, where people became much more likely to say positive things about immigrants and immigration on a wide variety of poll questions. And yet we had Trump's more restrictive policies. So I'm not sure, what pattern am I seeing here? I'm not seeing a clear pattern.
Let me first point out that when you say people were much more positive about immigration or wanted increases or whatever, those differences aren't huge. The Gallop does show that there's been an increase in the percentage of people who say they want immigration to be increased. But most people still don't want immigration to be increased. Most people also don't want it to be decreased. Most people kind of are sort of opt for the status quo.
Well, it's about one-third.
Your job, well, it's not exact, but it's something like that. Your job and my job is to convince people of what we think. You see what I mean? So that and
remember that one problem with this poll is that when someone says, I want immigration to stay the same, we don't know whether they're talking about the stock or the flow, because they don't ask that.
I guess, yeah.
If they're talking about the stock, then it's much more restrictive, because that means I want the percent of population, foreign-born percent of population, to be the same. So in other words, no more immigration. And if they're talking about the flow, it means I want immigration to continue at the same rate as it has been, which is very permissive. So I don't know, and it's probably a mix. It's probably some people think one and some people think the other, and the pollsters just don't ask. Right. So the sentiment's really hard to gauge, but because the sentiment's really hard to gauge, I don't see any support for the idea that there's some level of foreign-born percent of the population where people turn against immigration. That's just an assertion that has yet to be supported with evidence. I'm willing to believe it's possible. I'm not discounting it at all. I just want to see if I'm going to believe in this and make policy based on this, where's the evidence that that's a thing?
But what we're talking about here is what you're basically trying to pin me down on, not pin me down on, but basically get me to say, is a 60% drop in annual immigration in the flow, is that why am I picking that number? And I'm not picking that number. This is the point I wanted to make, is that I'm not disavowing a number. I'm saying there is no magic number. What I want, what I think we need as a country is a lower level overall. But the way you get there is you start from zero.
Sorry about that.
The reason I come up with 60% number is that what I would prefer in the way I think we should think about it is zero-based budgeting in immigration. In other words, you start at zero and then decide what groups of people, what categories of people are so imperative to let in that we let them in, despite the fact that I think large-scale immigration is incompatible with the goals and characteristics of a modern society. So what that would mean is, the way I envision it, is since pretty much all immigration has three components, family, skills, and humanitarian, that we define family immigration, people who get to come in because of who they're related to, as spouses and minor children of U.S. citizens. Even in the 20s, that was an unlimited category. Well, my grandmothers came in after the immigration reduction as a spouse. But that's a lot of people. That's 350, 400,000 people a year. Secondly is skills or employment-based categories. Who do we pick there? Noah's going to want a much larger number than I want. I think we need to limit that to genuine Einstein immigration. And what we have now is some people who are genuinely the best and brightest in the world. We actually do have that. I'm for that. We have a whole lot of people who aren't. I know people who come in on the EB1 category. The what's the specific
I think it's
word
business
for
owner.
It's supposed to be the highest. Well, no, EB1 is not a business owner. That's extraordinary ability.
That's
I think.
O1.
Isn't that what it's called? Anyway, it's supposed to
O1.
be the Einstein immigration. I mean, I know one guy specifically. I'm not going to name him. He's a great guy. I like him. He's not Einstein. I mean, it's some of this is gamed by lawyers. In fact, one way you might do that I could live with, but will never get enacted, is you just give an IQ test. You take an IQ test, you get 140 or 150 or whatever you want, and you just give your green card, go do whatever the heck you want. The third category of most immigration flows is humanitarian. And I'm actually it's refugees and asylum. And I'm actually much more skeptical of that even than I was before. The large majority of refugees we resettle are not people who are emergency cases. The UN actually keeps a list of that, people who can't stay where they are one more second. And asylum is a whole other show, frankly. It's a complete, it's an archaic, anachronistic, policy devised in reaction to World War II and the beginning of the Cold War. It was supposed to be for, a handful of Russian ballerinas, and it's turned into a mass immigration vehicle. So my point is, if you put those together, you would come up with something like, let's say, 450,000 immigrants a year. That's how I come up with the 60% number.
All right. So as far as I can tell, this entire, all these numbers and criteria were based entirely on vibes, but we're in a podcast, and I understand that maybe you did some analysis to come up with all these things that you can't show because you don't have the graphs, blah, blah, blah. But let's just talk about the skilled immigration piece of this for a second, which is, at this point, I think that your perspective is essentially a pro Xi Jinping, pro People's Republic of China perspective.
That's me. I'm a comm simp. Yeah.
I am hearing, yes. Well, you did go to school in the USSR. Maybe they turned you. No, I'm kidding. But no, what I'm hearing is arguments for policies that will end up dramatically weakening us in the competition with arguably our most powerful rival we've ever faced in our history as a nation. And that is bad, I think. So the United States has 1/4 the population of the People's Republic of China, which means that even if we were to produce top scientific engineering talent at 3 times the rate of China, at 3 times, which in some fields we actually do at about 3 times the rate of China, like in AI research. We produce top AI researchers about 3 times as much per capita as China does. But we have far fewer capitas because China is 4 times the size of us. And I don't know if that number penetrates people's minds. I don't know. Americans are not used to thinking of a country 4 times their size. It's like us versus, what's a country a quarter our size? Germany, Turkey? Like, these are small countries compared to us. We are a small country compared to China. And even if we dramatically outperform in how much talent we can produce, which we do per capita, there's no way we can match China's raw output of scientific talent because it's so huge. It produces talent at lower rates per capita than we do, but higher numbers because it's just so big. And the only way for us to equal, much less keep ahead of, China's scientific talent is with large amounts of high-skilled immigration, because we are a small country that is 1/4 the size of China. And that's just how it is.
The fact is, China's always had more people than the United States. India has way more people than the United States, and in fact, if not already, it will soon be exceeding China in population. China's population is decreasing, actually.
Yes, India is now #1.
Yeah, exactly. And so, that India and China had more people than the United States 100 years ago, 200 years ago. The idea, this is sort of, this is like in Dr. Strangelove, Mr. President, we cannot allow a mine shaft gap. This is sort of missile gap narrative. And the fact is that the United States has all kinds of advantages over China. And let me specifically address the immigration issue. One of the reasons we have this immigration is because, from China specifically, is because we have massively increased the number and proportion of Chinese students coming to the United States. This is actually a relatively new phenomenon. It's part of this idea that they would develop and liberalize, and then we'd all, hold hands and sing Kumbaya, which was always stupid. I talked to a Chinese student, for instance, who said, "Why on earth are you letting all these Chinese students into your country? You guys are suckers. Your universities is what they're coming for, and you are basically giving away access to your universities to your rival." And so now China's producing its own talent domestically now at this point, because we have helped seed their universities with talent that we trained. But we have to start by actually dramatically restricting the number of Chinese students allowed into the United States, because even though most of them are not, agents of the CCP, they're all de facto agents of the CCP, because even if they wish us well and want to become Americans, they have family back home that can and routinely is pressured and compromised. So they all become, in a sense, agents of the Chinese Communist Party, whether they want to be that or not. And most of them don't want to be that, although some of them do. My point is, one of the ways we respond to the challenge of China is by letting in fewer Chinese students.
I see that you're not especially familiar with the tech competition in areas like AI, semiconductors, etc. Because I feel, the idea that you would invoke China and India a century ago as sort of as if the China and as if the India of today is the same as the China or India of a century ago or 2 centuries ago. That is an absurd idea that just tells me that you've written these countries off in your mind because they weren't powerful at some point in the past. And so how could China be more powerful than us now? Yeah, they have 4 times as many people as we do, but they always did, blah, blah, blah. I mean, I see that you haven't been following the news of China's tech progress, of how China has now equaled us in AI research or surpassed us in certain cases, of how China has surpassed us in the 5G race and wireless networking technology, of how China threatens to surpass us in some other fields. And I see this is just not, it's not on your radar. It's not in your consciousness. It wasn't on your radar 10 years ago. It wasn't in your radar 20 years ago. It's not on your radar today, but it's big and important. And it's on my radar, and it should be on Americans' radar in general. It's something we have to think about and something we have to do. It is a competition that we don't just get to wave it away and imagine that this is the China of 1750 or the China of 1850 or whatever. We don't get to do that. We don't have that privilege. China is the most powerful. It is extremely technologically sophisticated, ahead of us in a couple key areas, and it is the most powerful competitor relative to us that we've ever faced, and it's 4 times our size. So I feel like if you don't follow this issue, if you don't have that urgency, that sense of urgency, then you're behind the times, and you need to start reading about that, because that's important and that's changed. The world has changed, and your opinions have to change with them. You need to update and look at the news and see what's going on. It's infuriating to me when I see, not just you, obviously, it's tons of people don't realize how much this situation has changed the game. I was in favor of a vastly expanded number of high-skilled immigrants 10 years ago, but I think that the urgency of national security with which we need this now is greater than it was 10 years ago. And so I'm even more strongly in support of the thing I was in support of before. And if you look at, anyway, I want to say that this is important and we need to think about. And
I get it.
Shutting China, and this idea of, if we just shut Chinese people out of our country, then China won't be a powerful competitor to us, is fantasy, abject, self-serving, ostrich head in the sand fallacy. That will not happen. Shutting Chinese people out of America will not cause China to go poof and go away as a competitor. That is a thing that will never happen.
Yeah. See, now what the term for this is straw man. You're making a straw man argument here. My point is not that China is somehow going to cease being a challenge if we reduce their foreign students. You said
every single Chinese person is an agent of the CCP. I don't have to straw man arguments of that, extremity.
Chinese students de facto are, especially if they go home. Absolutely they are, because they have vulnerabilities back home. They have relatives back home that are pressured. But my point is not that if we reduce the number of Chinese students, that fixes it. It's all set, no problem. The fact is that we are underinvesting in research and development dramatically. Letting in lots of foreign skilled workers is not going to help that. Letting in especially lots of Chinese skilled workers does create its own security vulnerabilities. So the idea that immigration is somehow it's an arms race is what you're saying, is that there's a sort of technological arms race, and I think there's probably something to that, actually.
Yeah.
I just
mineshaft gap, man.
What?
Mineshaft gap.
Yes, a mineshaft gap, and it's a real thing.
Yeah, it turned out it was real. It wasn't just a Dr. Strangelove joke. Look, when I agree with you about the investment, but cutting checks doesn't cut it if the numbers don't go to produce real stuff. And this is what Americans need to realize. Dollars are not enough. You need the dollars, but the dollars by themselves are not enough. You need the butts on the benches to do the damn research. You need the people, and America produces a disproportionately large number of top researchers. But we are only 4% of the world population, and we're only a quarter the size of China. We're a small country. We can't act like we're this giant, big world of a country that can shut out the rest of the world because we're a world unto ourselves. We are a small country competing in a big, big world, competing with some countries like China that are 4 times our size. We cannot afford to think like, isolationists anymore. We can't do that. We were much, much bigger in in the 1920s, when we shut off immigration, we couldn't even afford to do that then. But we were a much bigger country, especially compared to our competitors. We were 4 times the size of Germany or Japan, or twice the size of Japan. And so we outweighed our competitors. And we like to tell ourselves that our victories over those opponents came because of greater American can-do, know-how, and blah, 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 all this stuff, and Rosie the Riveter. But in fact, it was because we were big. And we're not big anymore, so we've got to make up for that by being good. And that requires that we have more than 4% of the world's population to draw from in terms of our talent.
So essentially, you're making a kind of arms race argument. And, if you want to make that argument about skilled immigration, which
I do.
Yeah, that's fine. I get it.
Yeah.
It seems to me that's a separate argument from overall immigration. I'm not conceding anything. I think we should still do it. But we don't need to take in 1 million people a year if that's what you want to do. In other words, you're making an argument for a particular sort of strategic immigration policy. I still think it's wrong-headed. But even if it weren't, that's not what our immigration policy is. That's not what our immigration flow is about. What you're saying is more Chinese and fewer Hondurans. Or that's the implication of what you're saying. But what you want to say is because we should take more Chinese, we also should be taking more Hondurans.
I'm not even talking about the Hondurans.
Sneaking in. Yeah, but I'm saying that the argument you're making is for a piece of immigration policy, not the actual, is for a theoretical immigration policy, not for the one we actually have.
Well, you're right. You're right. And that's not my only argument about immigration. It's not earlier I made an economic argument about taking care of grandma, which was a separate argument. I'm saying when you listed, you said, let's start at 0 and think of the immigrants we want. You spent most of that talking about why we want less high-skilled immigration, why you need to be Einstein with an IQ of 150 to get in. And I'm saying, no, that is waving a white flag to Xi Jinping. That is saying, hi, Xi Jinping, I surrender, because, if you only there's a tiny number of 150 IQ Einsteins. There's a tiny number of Einsteins and there's a modest number of 150 IQ people. And the point is that these research is very labor intensive. You need a lot of butts on benches. You need a lot of butts in front of computers coding. You need a lot of these people. Maybe they'll only have a 135 IQ, but they're still good. And so the number of people that we need is large because we have this small percent of the world's population. We're 4% of the world's population. Trying to contend with a country that's 19% of the world. No, not 19 anymore. We're 4.4. They're 18% of the world's population. So they're 4 times the size of us. We're trying to contend with that. When they were an impoverished agrarian backwater, sure, but they're not anymore. They've got things that we don't have. Huawei just came very close to taking over all of the world's 5G before we put together a very concerted diplomatic push to stop them. And their 5G is still better than ours. In terms of AI, our, chatbots are better, but their face recognition is much better. And so, when it comes to missiles that seek out our, tanks and missile launchers and whatever, jets and whatever we've got, aircraft carriers, and when they have the AI that recognizes what our little aircraft carrier looks like, it's like, oh, there you are, I kill you. That is something I do not want to lose. And yet it takes a very large number of people to do this AI research because it's incredibly labor intensive. You've got to train them, you've got to tweak the algorithms. There's just so much stuff. The more you talk to people in this industry, the more you realize how many people it takes. And, the idea that we're going to cut this down to just like a couple Einsteins is absolutely wrong. There are no Einsteins anymore.
We have crippled our ability to grow our own tech talent by foreignizing many of the tech departments in our universities. The National Science Foundation explicitly planned, Eric Weinstein's written about this. that they actually said we need to dramatically increase the number of foreign graduate students in order to reduce the cost, the wages that we have to pay to graduate student researchers. We have foreignized our own STEM graduate departments for basically mercenary, for economic reasons, self-interested reasons. And what we need to do is de-foreignize these areas of research and education.
No. Okay. So let's talk about just the field of AI, which is the field I was talking about, where I've got some numbers for you. The United States, with 4% of the world's population, produces about 20% of the top AI researchers in the world. We outperform dramatically in training our own people. And yet, China produces 29% of the world's top researchers in AI. China produces 29%. We produce 20%. We dramatically outperform China per capita in terms of producing the people who become the top AI researchers. Where do they all work? America. Both their researchers. The reason we still have a chance to lead China in AI is because we not only produce a ton of our awesome researchers, we also grab a bunch of theirs. And also people from Europe and people from India and people from that all come here to do their work too. And that's very important as well. Yes, we absolutely produce a lot. And this idea that getting a bunch of foreign researchers means we no longer produce them. We foreignize it. So they push Americans out and Americans are no longer doing these things. If you look at AI, where I know all the numbers right off the top of my head, if you look at this field, it's absolutely not happening. They're a complement, not a substitute. We dramatically outperform in how many people our local talent, native born talent cultivation of AI researchers, top AI researchers in America. We dramatically outperform, and we get all of theirs too. And that's the reason we have a chance to stay ahead of them. And so extrapolating this to other fields, when you talk about fields that have been foreignized, I looked at this data, right? And I looked at the fields that have been foreignized, and they are pretty narrowly defined esoteric fields that are super foreignized. In general, we've seen an increased number of Americans getting STEM degrees, getting STEM PhDs. We have increased our domestic production of talent as a percentage of our population and in absolute numbers, even as we've foreignized all these small departments that we can cherry pick and find. Foreign grad students have increased a lot, and I think that's great, but domestic, like native born American kids, with their apple pie and their little red wagons or whatever they've got, are becoming STEM researchers at higher rates than they used to. It's not this thing where they push us out, where foreigners come in and push Americans out of these things. That's just empirically not how it works. And Eric Weinstein can talk all he wants about the nefarious wage lowering, blah, blah, blah. I don't want to have to explain his bad economics again. But the point is that that it's just, we don't see it happening. America is producing more and more tech talent of our own, even as we draw in immigrants, but we're only 4% of the world. We can't go it alone.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm at the end of this discussion. Noah hasn't convinced me, but I'm out of stuff to say on this.
Okay, sorry. I'm sorry I ranted too long.
That's all right.
It's fine. Okay.
Now we let you ask a question. You ask your first question, Lucy.
Thank you. So Noah, you wrote a blog post about why immigration doesn't reduce wages, where you say, obviously, immigration increases labor supply, which does put downward pressure on wages. But then the immigrants themselves are consumers and investors. And so through that, they create demand for new jobs, which then, again, put upward pressure on wages. So that effect cancels out. One of the top comments on this blog post is from a real estate developer in Texas, which says, craft and labor wages are depressed by massive amounts of illegal labor being used by legitimate contractors in every trade. I lost a considerable amount of money in another business because I hired legal workers and provided health insurance, whilst my competitor worked illegal labor hard. You cannot inject 5 million low-skill, low-wage expectation workers into an economy and expect there to be no impact on wages when they're competing for jobs. So what do you say to this guy who is saying that this is not true?
I say, just because the wages at your business went down doesn't mean your business is the only business around. And so when you look at the statistics on what immigration, like a big surge of low-skilled immigration does to wages, when you look at the evidence, we've got lots of evidence because there's refugee waves. Suddenly there's a war or something like that, or war or a coup or something, or natural disaster, and you get a big wave of refugees that go to the neighboring country, right? They go from Syria to Turkey, or they go to some country that has a special deal with them, like Denmark, right? They go to Denmark, and they settle in some place because the Denmark government basically flips a coin and says, okay, you guys settle in this town of, Schmalgenblugen or whatever they call their towns. So, sorry, Denmark. I made fun of Schmalgenblugen. Anyway, so then
the bigotry is just everywhere here. So
yes, I know. And so a whole bunch of Syrian immigrants go to Schmalgenblugen suddenly because of a war in Syria, and we can look at the wages in the neighboring town that didn't get all the immigrants and the place where the Danish government decided to send the immigrants, and we can look at how wages change, and we can look at the Turkish border towns and blah blah blah. And we have to be careful about this because we have to make sure that we don't see the native-born people fleeing the area because they don't want to compete with the immigrants. So we've got to make sure there's not big population outflows from those areas. So we've got to be careful about some stuff, but it's pretty easy to look at these big waves and to see that when these big waves happen, wages for other existing immigrants in the area do go down, at least temporarily. And wages for native-born people in the area do not. And I can show you 20 papers with these refugee waves, all basically the same kind of thing, saying, look, we can't find native-born wages going down. And when people look into the details of why this happens, it's basically because native-born locals get a lot of extra stuff to do. They can build houses for the new arrivals. They can give them haircuts. They can, treat them as doctors and blah, blah, blah. That's for high skilled. But then for low skilled laborers, there's tons of stuff. Sell them stuff in stores, make stuff for them in restaurants. There's tons of stuff that native born people do for immigrants that they pay them to do. And the immigrants, they work and sometimes they have some money saved up. Sometimes they don't, which they can spend locally. But whether they do or not, they definitely work and they spend their money locally. And sometimes they send remittances out of the country, and that weakens their positive effect if they send remittances. But basically, we can't find a significant negative impact on native-born local people's wages when there's a big sudden wave of immigration. And you just have to remember that, immigrants increase labor supply, but they increase labor demand at the same time. And so I'm not saying this is an iron law of the universe. I still believe that immigration has the potential to decrease the wages of the native born, at least at the low skill end of the spectrum. But we're just not seeing it in the data. And so for every one of these like guys who in the comments who said, oh, well, wages, went down at my business, there's someone else who's like, oh, business boomed and I have to hire all these people, so it nets out. That's what we're seeing in the data. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah.
The National Academies of Sciences have looked at this issue on a national basis, not at particular cities or states. George W. Bush's Council of Economic Advisors did the same thing. And what they found was when you look at the big picture, there is a positive economic effect from immigration. It's just that it is the result of a transfer of wealth from the poor to the rest of society. The rough numbers from 2016, I think, were that something like $550 billion increase in economic output balanced against a $500 billion decrease in the earnings of people competing with immigrants. So you end up with you add them together, you do the arithmetic, $50 billion net benefit to the country. That's not nothing. I'll take half of that and retire, But it's not very much in a massive economy like ours. It is totally wiped out by the extra social service welfare costs, and it represents a kind of reverse Robin Hood policy. And ultimately, we have a responsibility to our own poor and our own workers who are losers in the globalization, in the development of globalization. And fact is, we are seeing the numbers of people like that increase. The number of people who are not in the labor market, they're neither working nor looking for work, is increased, and is increased pretty steadily. And immigration allows us to ignore that social phenomenon and not do whatever it is we need to do to try to reverse that and bring people back into the world of work. It's a social problem. And I don't have a magic answer to what we do to increase the labor participation rate, but I do know there's no imperative to find an answer if you're just able to import the folks from overseas.
Well, let me talk about that labor force participation rate, because that's a number that I do happen to know a bit about. So labor force participation rate affects how many people are looking for work, but it also is affected by aging. So when we get older as a country, our labor force participation rate naturally goes down because people retire. You get more retirees. Also, when you have more young people getting education instead of going immediately to work, labor force participation rate goes down, although that's a smaller effect. Aging is the big one. So if you look at the prime age labor force participation rate of just people who are 25 to 54, an age when almost everybody's out of school. I wasn't, but almost everybody's out of school. And then almost nobody's retired yet. When you look at that, the prime age employment to population ratio, the number of people in the prime age category with jobs, is as high as it was at the peak in 2019. It's as high as the peak it was in 2006 or 7. It's as high as it was in the peak in 1989, 90. And it's hit 80%. And it shows no deficit at all when you just look at prime age. The decrease in overall labor force participation is due to aging, population aging. If you want to counteract population aging, I know a way.
Which is importing people, which the Social Security Administration itself acknowledges is a highly inefficient means of trying to support, to buttress Social Security, because immigrants age a year at a time, just like everybody else. But let's get back to the wage issue, the labor force participation issue. The fact is, especially for people without a bachelor's degree, non-college workers, labor force participation is down. And that is something that we need to address as a society, because it creates significant social dysfunction. And I don't have a magic solution to how to deal with that. What I know is there's no political imperative or business imperative to deal with it if you have other people willing to hang the drywall. And that is
it's down because of aging.
I don't see any way around it.
Aging. That labor force participation rate is down because there's more old people. That's why it's down. It's old people.
But it's down among teenagers, down among under 25 people.
Yeah, because more people went to college.
That's separate from school. Even
college
people aren't in school. So the
look at prime age labor force participation for people
without a college degree.
Yeah.
Prime age without a college degree. Here, let me look it up for you here. Hold on. It's still going to be, let's see here where we are, 18 to 64. Here's adults without a bachelor's degree. Let me look for the general number here. I have regional. I don't want that. Total. It's, let's see, 2022. It's down significantly. It's down
what number are you looking at?
5 points for men and women. For men, it's down 5 points. 89 to 84%. These are men prime age without a bachelor's degree. This is something that immigration didn't cause. This is a phenomenon that we're seeing for other reasons. Immigration removes the imperative to address this phenomenon, and it's going to get worse, and it has social consequences. And we have a responsibility to not screw over.
If you're just looking at men, then women must have increased to match, because overall, look at prime age employment population ratio for people for all genders without a college degree.
I have 83% in 2000 and 78% in 2022.
What website are you looking at to get that?
We just published this ourselves last
What's
fall.
The data source for that?
The data source is the CPS.
I see, because I'm seeing essentially flat for people without college degrees.
This is well, I mean, I don't know what to tell you here. This is native born too. So this is native born. They don't break it out. We actually break out their data. CPS doesn't report native born versus foreign born.
I see.
I mean, they collect the data. They don't report the data that way. You have to.
All right. So basically, overall, we see the same percentage of prime age Americans having jobs that they always did. Right. And we see at the lower end of the scale, we've seen wages go up. In fact, we have seen wages at the lower end of the scale outpace high-end wages since around 2013. For about a decade now, we've seen, and maybe you can say, okay, well, that was because large-scale, low-skilled immigration from Mexico went down a lot between 2007 and 2013. Maybe that was lowering wages for native-born people without college degrees, and maybe that shock is over, and that's why low-end wages are going up again. Maybe so, but the point is that we haven't been seeing any sort of collapse in economic outcomes for people at the bottom of the U.S. economic distribution at all. We haven't been seeing a decline. We've been seeing incomes go up. We've seen a slight decrease in income inequality over those 10 years. We've seen, I can't speak to the special data set that you use that breaks out native born people, but we've seen good employment levels. And we've seen, decent wage growth over the last 10 years. And so, yeah, if you look at the macro data, I was talking with the refugee waves, I was talking about the micro data. When you look at the macro data, I see a fairly encouraging picture.
We're blind men feeling the elephant. The picture I'm looking at is discouraging. If prime age men who are native born are significantly less likely. I mean, we're talking about, what is that? A 7% decline. It's a 5-point decline, 7% decline in over a period of 22 years in their engagement in the labor force. In other words, they're either working or they're looking for work. That is
but women went up, though. Women went up.
Say it again.
Women went up. You said men only.
No, women went down too, even more actually. Native-born women without a college degree, prime age, their labor force participation rate went down from 77 to 70.
It's difficult to believe that this data looks so different from the overall data, but okay. Maybe
I'll send you the link afterwards.
Right.
We'll share the data source. Yeah, we'll share data source.
I'll check out the methodology used to identify this, because there's always one thing you learn about like immigration restriction people is that there's a lot of playing fast and loose with the data that goes on in this. I remember. Thank you very much. I remember there was a sort of a famous paper that claimed that the Mariel boat lift reduced made things worse for something like native-born Miamians of a certain Miamian men of a certain age who were Black or Hispanic without a college degree, and this limited to that. And it turned out there were like 7 or 8 total observations in that whole subgroup that they used. And so it was essentially statistical noise. And so you've got to look closely at these things, because in my experience, the immigration restriction is start from the conclusion that we need to lower immigration and work backwards to what data they would need to support that conclusion. And I'm sure that there are people on the pro-immigration side who do the same. I could actually name you one or two of those people. But in general, I see this as a pervasive problem on the immigration restriction side. Okay, I want to change the subject if I may.
You may. I had a second argument to say from this guy who commented on your blog post, and then you can ask your question or whatever you have to say. So he also says that immigrants are sending money abroad to their home countries, to their families, which decreases the amount that's spent through consumption and investments. And then you have Americans like this guy who is a property owner who has to pay property taxes to build schools and educate these illegal children. So what do you say to this argument that these immigrants are sending large amounts of money to their home countries, do not contribute to the US economy?
That's correct. So when immigrants send remittances overseas, that reduces the amount that they spend locally. When they spend less locally, they boost demand less for local labor, and it decreases that labor demand effect that offsets the labor supply effect. In other words, remittances lower the economic benefit of immigration. It's just money leaking out. Does that mean I want to stop people from doing remittances? Not necessarily, because, their old grandmas back in wherever got to eat somehow. But remittances do reduce the economic benefit of immigration. And yeah, that's absolutely right.
And I would argue that, to make an argument that Noah might have made, is that the amount isn't that huge when you look at the entire economy. On the other hand, it's concentrated. It's an outflow of capital from often from the most capital-starved places in the country, and it's used for consumption. It is paying for grandma's, living expenses instead of being invested, in a food cart or a taxi cab or something like that. So the effect nationally probably isn't huge, but the effect in a focus in the places where immigrants are living is pretty significant.
I agree with that. Yes.
I would say not all the
places, some of the places. There are a few countries where the people from those countries send a very large amount of remittances, and in the sort of enclaves where people from those countries are concentrated, you're going to see a much more concentrated effect. There's a lot of countries you don't see much remittance from. So, like India, you don't see a lot of remittances from India.
Not here. From the Middle East, you see a lot, but not from here.
That's true.
Yeah.
Because they're blue collar workers mainly in the Middle East from India, whereas here they're not, or less likely to be.
So all right. I want to end by actually helping Mark out here, because I've been fairly aggressive in my, arguing against Mark here. However, there is a real drawback of immigration with the way that America's current political economic system is set up that very few people talk about. So I'll give the anti-immigration people some ammo here, because I'm just a nice guy and I've spent the rest of this podcast just yelling in your face. So here's some ammo. America is very bad at building new housing. And an influx of people into a region, when you don't accommodate it with new housing, will push up rents and will displace people from that area. And so we have seen extreme sort of backlashes against immigrants, this is especially true of immigrants with a lot of money, who either come with money, which is only a few actually, but there are some, and buy property here, or who have high earning engineer jobs and just are willing to pay a lot for their apartment rent. And so we have seen in those superstar cities where there's a lot of, skilled immigrants and a few wealthy immigrants coming over, we've seen prices get pushed up, and we've seen backlashes, sometimes xenophobic backlashes, like the Texas bill that is going to prevent Chinese citizens
Oh, yeah.
buying property. Also prevent Russian citizens from buying property. And North Koreans, all the North Koreans who are going to buy up Dallas. Anyway,
It's a niche real estate market.
Iranians too. Yeah, a very niche real estate market. Like Iranians, you're 40 years late. Anyway, but the point is, it's obviously aimed toward Chinese property buyers, and you see a similar backlash in Vancouver, Canada. Nice liberal Vancouver, blah blah blah. This is the biggest. So when you look at that National Academy of Sciences report, Mark, that you referenced before, you see that the overall fiscal contribution of immigrants is positive. For low-skilled immigrants, it's about break even. For high-skilled immigrants, it's very strongly positive. Like, skilled immigrants aren't using welfare and they're just paying a crap ton of taxes. So that's good fiscally. But if you look, but the effect on local housing markets is going to be negative for a lot of the people who live there because rents will go up. And it's going to make a lot of people mad. And as a country, we need to figure out how to deal with this. This is, if we really want immigrants to continue to come into our society in large numbers, which of course I argue we do, we need to solve this housing problem. And, one solution to this that people have come up with is to divert immigrants to areas where rents and prices are actually depressed, that are declining regions, so they can revitalize those regions. That's a lot easier said than done. Canada tries to do this too. They have a little success. They do it sometimes, but it's kind of hard to do. So being a nation of immigrants that also does not build housing is a difficult thing to pull off. And so there is my immigration restrictionist argument that I give to you, because no one's actually talking about this. Everyone's talking about like the wage thing, or like, oh my God, Chinese spies or something.
Yeah, thank you. I'll file that away. And again, that's a function. That's immigration exacerbates that, but that's a function of sort of NIMBYism where, but it's not even just that. It's also geography. Yeah. In other words, if you're San Francisco or LA or New York, there's just nowhere to expand to, or at least there's fewer places to expand to. And, if you're expanding into San Bernardino and further out in the desert, you're talking, 2-hour, 3-hour commutes, that kind of thing. Whereas if you're in, Oklahoma City, you can spread out pretty much in all directions. So I'm not even sure there's a good way around that, even if you changed rules related to construction and zoning and what have you. But so thank you. I appreciate that. I'll credit you if I use that. But right. One thing I wanted to address that you mentioned in one of your blog posts, this was the U.S. cannot afford to turn against immigration a few weeks back. And the point you made is something that I hear often, is that we need to be tough at the border on illegal immigration. In other words, we need to make sure that, you were talking about the, Biden's policies at the border and asylum and the rest of it. Tough on illegal immigration, but permissive, obviously, on legal immigration. And my sort of reaction to that is, where has that ever happened? In other words, high levels of legal immigration, whether because of the mechanics of immigration or because of the political dynamics, lead to high levels of illegal immigration. Say, illegal, legal see, illegal no, to put it in sort of Castro's formulation.
Is there evidence for that?
Doesn't work. Where has it happened? I mean, show me where it's possible that you can get the political will to enforce strict immigration rules, not just enact the rules, but actually follow through and enforce them, and also have high levels of legal immigration. And I think the reason for that, it's both practical in the sense that legal and illegal immigrants are not different species. They're in the same families. Sometimes the same person flips back and forth between being legal and illegal. But also politically, the forces, whether leftist or business oriented, that push for high legal immigration always also push for weaker enforcement. And so it seems to me it's one of those things to say I want, low illegal immigration but high legal immigration is like saying if there were less gravity, I could run faster. That's true, but it's not something that I think is actually practically achievable. I'm not making a normative argument even here. I'm just saying what makes you think that's even possible?
Well, the Senate bill in 2013. I don't know.
Yeah, but that doesn't. Again, that's paper. The bill, Bush's bill in 2005, 6, and 7 that had various iterations. Kennedy, McCain was one of them. The same thing promises, to. I mean,
okay,
look,
so the
1986 bill.
The real example here is George W. Bush.
Yeah.
So George W. Bush, despite being a bad president overall, was effective.
We're agreed on that one.
Yes, he was effective at doing the very thing you said was impossible, of encouraging legal immigration while cracking down on illegal immigration. The wall that Trump wants to build was pretty much built in 2006. It was the Secure Fence Act.
It was enacted in 2006.
Yes,
it wasn't built yet.
You're right. Yeah. You're right. It was built between 2006 and 2013.
And look, for all of Trump's bloviating about the wall, and I'm not against it, that's just one tiny piece of immigration enforcement. That's not some kind of solution. I'm talking about follow through to make sure that employers are only hiring legal workers. I'm talking about consistent immigration enforcement, not just something that the cameras can show a picture of.
The Bush and Obama administrations. By the way, the most enthusiastic deporter of immigrants was Barack Obama.
No, that's a talking point that what's her name, Janet Murguia from La Raza came up with, and it's kind of true, but kind of not. And what Obama did was basically he took the consistent increase in deportations that we saw under the Clinton and Bush administrations that were real because they made steady, consistent investments in that. And then he sort of benefited and plateaued. In other words, to call him a deporter in chief is sort of, you're born on third base and think you hit a triple. You know what I mean?
Well, I'm not calling him that. I'm not calling him that because of what someone from La Raza said. I'm calling him that because my sister worked in the Justice Department at the time, prosecuting appeals to deport immigrants. So my sister was one of Obama's, immigration deportation people. And she did that. And so I know quite a bit about the efforts to do it. So what Obama kept deportation levels at increased them slightly from where they were under Bush. The big increase had been under Bush. So, but that was just an aside about Obama. Bush was really the guy who stepped up deportation. So Bush encouraged legal immigration and took visibly effective action against illegal immigration at the same time. So if you think that it can't be done politically, I would just point to George W. Bush as someone who did it.
He did it he did it partly and in a partial and not very effective way. The illegal population did not decrease, and the number of people, number of employers sanctioned for hiring illegal immigrants, which is what you need to do to actually control illegal immigration. It's the sine qua non of it, reached its lowest level ever under George W. Bush. In 2004, there were 3 people, if I recall the number correctly, 3 employers in the entire nation who were even cited for knowing employment of illegal immigrants. Bush is just not that great an example, and it was only at the end of his administration where, after having lost the push for amnesty and increased immigration that he had made in 2005, 6, and 7, that for about a year, he kind of unleashed, as it were, what was already at that point DHS. And they did actually get some, make some headway. And then bingo, Obama comes in, and the increase in deportations, even Obama admitted, was legerdemain, because they counted an increasing share of border cases as deportations, which they hadn't before. In other words, he was playing statistical games. I'm not saying Obama. I mean, I yearn for the good old days of the Obama administration compared to what we're seeing now. But this is not a counterfactual. This is not showing that you can have sustained immigration enforcement that limits and shrinks illegal immigration while you're also having mass legal immigration. I don't think it's possible. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't buy it. I don't think it can work. And look at the dynamics, the political dynamics now. Who among those pushing for maintaining or increasing legal immigration levels is seriously willing to put their political capital to use to limit illegal immigration? I don't know who that person is. If you can find them, let me know.
I don't know, but I just remember when that 2013 Senate bill was canceled by the anti-immigration people in the Tea Party Congress after the Senate worked out this bipartisan compromise to do exactly the thing that you just said nobody wants to do.
Yeah, but look, maybe I don't know if this is a point to end on or not, but the politics of immigration has been poisoned by the 1986 bill, which promised to do exactly what you were saying: legalize the illegal population. The other part of it, a couple of years later, was passed an immigration increase in exchange for prohibiting the employment of illegal immigrants in the future. That was that 1986 IRCA deal. Reagan signed it.
Right.
It was a con. It was a lie to begin with, because the amnesty happened up front, and the people who were pro-amnesty but anti-enforcement, who had swallowed that as a compromise, as soon as everybody was amnestied, introduced legislation, and I mean Ted Kennedy and Orrin Hatch specifically, to undo and make it legal again to hire illegal aliens, to undo the enforcement part of it. So
wait, I thought the enforcement was basically canceled by courts, not by that legislation.
What do you mean?
I thought it was. I thought they got sued for that enforcement for discrimination.
There were claims of discrimination. Yeah. That's not why they stopped. It was La Raza released a report in conjunction with Kennedy and Hatch's effort to repeal employer sanctions, claiming that there was discrimination. And the only reason they failed is because Coretta Scott King, believe it or not, came out and with a sort of open letter to several other black leaders, Walter Washington and others, demanding that they keep employer sanctions in place. But it's a policy choice not to pursue enforcement, worksite enforcement. It's a policy choice. And I don't see anyone willing to make the opposite policy choice who's also in favor of very high immigration. Maybe such a person exists. I don't know who that is.
Well,
I take your word for it. I don't think I believe you. I'm just saying who in politics, what political forces are there?
We're about to run out of time, but I will note that the phenomenon of people coming across the border and just illegally and just being undocumented immigrants, working at jobs, whatever, is mostly done at this point. And instead, what we've got is the asylum spamming sort of thing. Now, most of what we call illegal immigration is people illegally crossing the border, turning themselves into the Border Patrol and saying, give me an asylum hearing. And that's a very different situation. And it's not necessarily going to be prevented by the same sort of methods that people were talking about in 1986.
2 points. One is the reason you're seeing this asylum flow, where it's essentially illegal immigration by through that means, is a series of, again, policy choices that have incentivized it, and then under this administration, supercharged it. The other point, though, I would make is
although the administration is reversing itself on this.
Yeah, a little bit. We'll see if that means anything, because there's a lot of loopholes, a lot of exceptions. We've written on how it's not what you think it is. But they've taken into their custody and released. These are give-ups, they call them in the Border Patrol. Something like 2 million people under Biden. It's like 1.9 million. But there's an additional million people who are what they call gotaways, that they know were crossed the border, but they didn't catch. So my point here is that the kind of illegal immigration that was not connected to gaming the asylum system is still very much with us. It's not going away. And
it is much reduced
even
from
if
what
we
it
get
used
control
to
of
be.
what?
It is much reduced from what it was in the 2000s.
Yeah, asylum has taken the place of it.
Asylum has taken the place of the old paradigm of just, hopping the border to get some work.
That's because the opportunity is there. Asylum is a means of hopping the border in order to get some work.
Well, in order to get some work and, live in a place that doesn't suck.
Yeah, well, but I mean, what were people doing before?
Part job. It's partly,
trying
nice
to come
suburban
here
house instead of whatever the heck you were living in El Salvador.
Before they were using asylum, it was the same thing. They were sneaking over the border to get a job and live in a place that didn't suck. Asylum is just the gimmick that we have permitted people to use. You see the same thing in Europe. You see the same thing to some degree even in Israel. I was over there last year, and they have the African asylum seekers that they're really not sure they're trying to deal with somehow. Australia deals with the same thing. So asylum is a big deal.
The asylum system has been spammed.
Yes, it has been spammed, in fact.
Asylum spamming. See, look, I've given you the housing argument, and I've given you a new term of asylum.
I like the spam. Yeah, so I will credit you with that one.
Never say I didn't. I didn't.
I'll give you a hat tip. Yeah. There you go. Thank you.
Anyway, we've got to wrap up here. Lucy, did you have any last questions?
Yeah.
I think Lucy's the host here. I don't know.
My last page.
Yeah.
No, so like if you had a minute or two to speak to everyone about immigration, what would you tell them? All Americans, all people in America. What's the message?
We haven't said over the past 2 hours, you mean?
What's the message you would,
Mark, go first.
You would tell everyone.
Okay. Well, my message would be, we need a breather from immigration. We've had 50 years, more than that, of extremely high immigration, and we need a breather. And it's going to help us not just economically and fiscally, but it's going to help us politically by the leadership classes showing that they're responsive to public concerns. We're not going to get everything I want, but if our leadership classes had conceded to just a 10% reduction in legal immigration, I think a lot of the political tumult you're seeing now, certainly a lot of the energy that the Trump people have, would not be nearly as significant, nearly as problematic, frankly, as what we've seen over the past, whatever this is, 6, 7, 8 years.
Thank you.
You're up, Noah.
All right. My message would be to Americans that this nation is a team. We are Team America. We are not just a collection of people who happen to live next to each other and, share the same garbage collection or whatever. We are a team, and a team needs recruits. Any team that gives up its draft picks and gives up its recruiting and blah, blah, blah will be a weaker team. And we need to cultivate, obviously, the people who are already on our team. And we also need new recruits to the team. And we are facing challenges that in some ways are bigger than any challenges we've faced before as a nation. We've never faced the kind of aging that we face in the short term right now. We've never faced the kind of geopolitical, sort of rivalry that we have with China. We've never faced a competitor that has those capabilities that China does and is as big and powerful as them. And so our team is facing these unprecedented threats to us. And we need to continue to strengthen that team the way we always have. America's superpower versus other nations has never been that our flag looks better or that our rock music is better. It's certainly not that our haircuts are better. All right. It is that we have been able to recruit the people of the world, not just the best and the brightest, not just the Einsteins, although the Einsteins are super important, but also regular laborers to build houses, who built out this country, to build canals and railroads, whatever. And also just, middle-class people who have convenience stores so their kids can go to college and become engineers somewhere. All of those recruits have been very valuable for our country, and we've come out on top again and again, and we've remained a team. And I think that we must continue the approach that's been successful for us before, that's been successful for our team, and that this is our overriding imperative.
Wow, awesome. This is great. Well, we just ran out of time, so thank you both for this fun, insightful, interesting discussion.